Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 3. In this week, we're going to be covering chapters 5 and 6, which deals primarily with doing a literature review, which will also be part of your assignment for this week. And then the second chapter, chapter 6, is going to deal with data collection, specifically what types of data you're going to be looking to collect based on what type of study you're going to be doing. All right, so let's start by going into chapter 5, where we're going to talk about how to do a literature review. Well, I understand that for many of you, this may not be the most interesting, fun, exciting of topics. Hopefully, I'll present it in a way that'll make sense to you at the very least, and that you'll be able to use because, as I mentioned, this is going to be one of the assignments that you're going to be doing this week is to do your own literature review. And of course, it's a really critically important part of any type of research study. All right, let's get started by talking about what a literature review actually is. So, a literature review is a survey of everything that has been written about a particular topic, theory, or research question. It's generally the next step after you devise your research question, your hypothesis. Now you're basically going to do the research to see what has been out there already on this topic. So, if I was going to do research question based on hypothesis that deals with something like, um, does DBT, I think this is the example I used before, dialectical behavioral therapy, does DBT help teenagers deal with addiction? Let's just say something like that, right? The first thing I'm going to do before even doing an experiment, before doing any kind of data collection, devising a study, is I just want to see what is the available research out there. Maybe this is already a question that's been answered, right? And I'm not going to know that unless I do a literature review. Now, a couple things that are kind of important here, right? So, a literature review provides context for your research. It justifies the research you are proposing. It ensures that your proposed research has not been carried out by another person. And if you find it has, then your literature review should specify replication as necessary. In this case, right, DBT, say helping with addiction in teens, maybe there has been a study that's shown that it's really effective, but it's only been done on, say, white teenagers in the Midwest of the United States. But your population is something like black teenagers in the Southeast. So very often you may find this as you start doing your own literature reviews. Uh, the studies that have been done in the past are usually very narrowly defined with their populations. So sometimes replication is needed just because you're trying a different population or a different subset of a population. Literature reviews, they're important because they show where your proposed research fits into existing body of knowledge. They enable the researcher to learn from previous theories on the subject. They illustrate how the subject has been studied previously. They highlight flaws in previous research. I'll point out this one, highlighting flaws in previous research, and the next one, outlining gaps in previous research, is really kind of the two big areas, right? Because here's the thing. If you are proposing a study, you have this in mind, say DBT, addiction in teens, right? If my idea was to do an actual research study on it, and I find that there's a lot of available research, there's really no need for it to be replicated, right? If all these things that I mentioned so far, I find by doing a literature review, yeah, there's really no need to do a study. I'm not going to do anything else. It's not like I'm still going to do the study and then say I shouldn't have done the study. But if you find that there are flaws in the research, if you find that there's gaps, right? Maybe you see, yeah, DBT is a therapy that's been used with teens, but not for addiction. Maybe this is something that could be used, right? That's a gap in the previous research. Those are really the sweet spot, right? That's the area that you want to really focus in on. And that's why literature review would be really important for doing a study. Because then it helps give you a little bit more direction and focus, right? You're doing your new study to highlight, in this case, a DBT, teens with addiction, and you're specifically saying this is a gap in the research. That's why my study is so important, is because it's going to kind of close that gap. All right, so what are the steps in doing a literature review? You guessed it, the first step is research. Exhaustive research. If you're actually doing a literature review, not for just a college class, but for a research project, that literature review isn't just uncovering a minimum number, like, oh, well, 10. We'll just say 10 is all that's required, right? Maybe for a college assignment, such as the one you're going to do this week, there's a minimum number. But for an actual research study, you have to look at everything. And in fact, if you don't, that kind of opens up a gap in your research, because then somebody who's reviewing it would say, why is it you only selected 10? Why is it you only selected 5? Why is it you only selected this number of research articles to review? Are you cherry picking? Are you selectively finding articles? Right? So it is exhaustive. Now, this is another area where hopefully you're talking about a subject that hasn't been exhaustively researched, right? Because you're trying to do research in it. So there really shouldn't be a ton of available articles out there. But this is always where you're going to start. It's also worth noting that not only is it exhaustive, but you kind of really have to cover the full basis of that topic. Right, so if I'm looking at DBT and addiction, I'm not just going to look at anything that may suggest DBT could be helpful. I may also look at the articles that talk about how DBT is not really a good choice, right? And you may think, well, why would I waste my time with that? I'm trying to find out, I'm trying to sell this idea of using this thing. That's why I'm doing the research. Well, no, you're trying to uncover the truth, right? So you have to have the whole picture. You can't just pick and choose what you want to do. So research, always the first step. Second step, critical appraisal. You're going to evaluate the literature, determine the relationship between the sources, and ascertain what has been done already and what still needs to be done. Another way of saying this, you are analyzing all of that research you uncover. And keep in mind, as many of you are well aware, a journal article, a research article, isn't necessarily just one or two paragraphs, right? These are several pages. So you're reading, the equivalent of a book's worth of different research articles. So it's quite a bit sometimes to really kind of compare and contrast. And some of them, it is sort of like comparing apples and oranges. As I mentioned, really the point here, if you're doing to do a study, is to try to uncover gaps or pitfalls, things that haven't been looked into. So in that case, it can kind of be a little bit difficult to do that analysis part. And then, of course, the final part here is writing. You have to actually put on paper explaining the steps you took, the research you found, and the analysis that you provided there. Now, that's the steps for actually doing the literature review. As far as the literature review in terms of the paper, right, that you're writing, there's always going to be three main components. The first, just like with any kind of college level paper, academic type paper, is you're going to have an introductory paragraph. This is usually one paragraph long, where you clearly identify and discuss the topic and its significance. Make sure, and this is something that sometimes students get wrong. In the introduction, you really shouldn't be presenting like a lot of statistics necessarily. The introduction is really meant to be your area to kind of pique the interest of whoever's reading. I'm kind of a foodie, everybody, so the way I like to describe it is your introduction is your appetizer, right? It's not meant to fill you up. It's meant to be something to kind of hold you off a little bit before you get your main meal, to pique your interest, make you really excited to eat your main meal, and kind of demonstrate in a really small, short little way, what the kitchen's capable of, what that restaurant's capable of. In the introduction, it should be clear that you're talking about a certain topic and kind of give a little bit of background to it, but you shouldn't explicitly say that. So don't write in an introduction to any kind of literature review, I'm writing this because in this assignment I'm told to do da 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 or anything like that, right? Don't do that. You also shouldn't use citations in the introduction. That's kind of a solid rule. It's sort of an unwritten rule, but it's a pretty solid rule. The one paragraph one, it says usually, I say generally clear, concise is best, but it's not necessarily improper to have more than one paragraph for the intro. I just feel it's kind of redundant. All right, so that's the introduction. Second part, the body. This is by far the majority of your paper. Instead of it being one paragraph, usually, right, it's multiple paragraphs. It's usually multiple pages. Paragraphs are based on topic, not a paragraph for each reference. So this is what I have students really make a huge mistake of. They view the actual paper, the literature review, as being a book report, right? So I did my introduction. Now I'm going to talk about this article from Smith and colleagues. In this article, Smith did a survey on DBT use and popularity among teenagers. He found da 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 da. And then a new paragraph that says, in another article by Carter and colleagues, they discovered that DBT in adult populations is really successful in treating addiction. And I'm going to talk about that article, right? And this is what students do. What you're doing in that case is you're describing. It's sort of like a book report, like when you're a kid, right? Where you stand up in front of class and you hold up something and you talk about it. That is not what you're doing in a literature review. The key to a literature review, yes, is a little bit of this is what that article was about, but it's the analysis, right? Remember, it's this critical appraisal that we care about. I can read an abstract of an article perfectly fine on my own. What differentiates a literature review is your analysis of it. A good way of describing this is if I asked you if you saw a certain movie, right? Whatever, movie you think of off the top of your head. I'll go really, really old school and I'll say something like Goonies, right? Man, I love the Goonies. I know I'm old. It's from the 80s, but it's still a classic, right? If I asked you, did you see the Goonies? A description would be you literally telling me what that movie's about, right? A group of kids that end up stumbling on a pirate ship. Hopefully that's not a spoiler for anybody. It's been out for a while, so if you haven't watched it yet, that's your fault. That's a description, right? Don't do that in a literature review. Do this, right? If I said, describe the Goonies for me, or talk about the Goonies, or what did you think about the Goonies, right? You would actually say, oh, it's a really good movie. The reason why it's my favorite is because the acting was actually really good in it. It was an original plot line. And I don't know, I think it just kind of appeals to sort of that inner child in all of us that are looking to explore, but also have a sense of social connection, right? That's an analysis. That's me giving an analysis of what I think of that movie. That is kind of what you're doing with this literature review, right? It's not subjective. It's going to be something that's more objectively based. Hopefully that helps. Last component of the literature review is the conclusion. Again, this should really only be one paragraph. Some people will do two. That's fine, but really try to shoot for just a very clear, concise conclusion. You should summarize and defend the importance of the topic that you presented throughout the paper, but it's not just restating it, right? And it's not going into detail. It is a short, brief, like, this is what I talked about, this is why it's important, and this is kind of where the future should be, right? That's especially important if you're doing a literature review to propose a research study, right? So, teenage addiction is a rising concern in this country, especially with opioids. That is why I think that new therapies are going to be instrumental in helping to face this rising challenge to the United States. DBT seems to be a very clear choice to be used. It is a minimally invasive intervention. It's one that can be easily taught and learned by therapists and utilized with teenage populations. The next step would be to do research studies, experiment, quasi-experiment, correlate, whatever it may be, looking at the efficacy of this intervention with that population, right? That's kind of like what I'd be looking at for the conclusion. As far as the body of the literature review and how you kind of present the different topics, how it's organized, there's a couple different techniques you can use here, different kind of themes. The first one is you could present that information thematically. So this would oftentimes be done when you're trying to explain key themes or issues relevant to the topic. This is the most common way to organize a literature review. So what that means is you're doing paragraphs, right? Doing a little paragraph header on there, and you're looking at key components. So using the example I've had, if I was looking at something like the use of DBT with addiction in teens, I may present under one large paragraph or several paragraphs, paragraph header, several paragraphs that talk about research that looks at the efficacy of DBT with addiction. Then maybe I'd have a separate paragraph header with different paragraphs looking at the articles that talk about the need for counseling as being an effective intervention for teens with addictions. Then maybe I'll do another paragraph header with several paragraphs underneath that talking about articles that look at the use of DBT just in general with teens, right? So that's thematically, it's based on the themes, is what we were talking about. So I think that's definitely probably one of the most common. I would say that's probably the one most of you should probably use most of the time. There's two others here that may fall into place depending on what kind of literature your review you're doing, either now or in the future. The second one is what's known as methodologically listed. So with this, you're going to be discussing interdisciplinary approaches to a topic, or when discussing a number of studies with a different approach. So if instead of me talking specifically about DBT and addiction with teens, maybe I was just looking at a literature review of available interventions for teen addiction, right? And I'm trying to see like maybe which one is the most effective. I may have a paragraph header with several articles under, or several paragraphs underneath that talking about articles that look at medical interventions. Maybe there's medications that can be given, say to make kids not drink alcohol, like Antabuse is the name of a drug that oftentimes is used for that, right? So that's that kind of method, right? The next one may be something that'll be a little bit different. Sometimes you see where you'll have this and it'll talk about the different types of studies. So maybe if you have a lot of literature and you want to first list, say, experiments and articles that talk about experiments, and then you want to list articles that talk about quasi-experimental approaches, and then maybe you have another one that talks about naturalistic observations, right? That may be a way of kind of organizing it. The last one on here is chronologically, and that's really when we're talking about a historical approach. If you want to talk about sort of like the evolution. So an example of this would be me talking about DBT. I'll stick with that as an example. Maybe I wanted to just talk about how it expanded. So early on, DBT was first used only with borderline individuals. In fact, that's why it was first devised, was for use with borderline. Then I can talk about how it was kind of expanded, and then now here's a new paragraph header where it talks about how it was expanded to just suicidality in general, right? Used whether it's for borderline or major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, anybody who's suicidal, right? And then maybe I can talk about how in a new paragraph header, several paragraphs, articles that talk about it being used for bipolar disorder, used with different populations, right? And in that case, we're talking about the years, right? So maybe 1980s, borderline, 1990s, we're talking about suicidality, 2000s, and that's kind of how it would be presented. So like I said, that's usually more so the case if you're talking about some kind of historical evolution. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about the way in which a literature review should be presented and kind of the key components, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the acceptable sources of information for literature review. This is really a topic I could probably go on and on for quite a while. I think the longer I have taught, the more, I'll be honest with y'all, frustrated I get over some of the stuff that students use as being quote unquote like acceptable, credible sources of information. AI is not, right? I think AI can be a good source of finding sources sometimes. So what I mean by that is if you wanted to use AI to say find all or give me a list of all research articles done in the last 10 years on DBT in teens and addiction, right? That may be good. Maybe because in the past, I can tell you most AIs would give fictitious sources, and some still do. So it's a good starting point. It's an additional tool, but you still have to go through all of those and verify that they're actual sources, and you have to also read the articles. But that can be a good way of narrowing it down. Wikipedia is not a credible source, right? Wikipedia, though, likewise, can be a helpful way of finding the information, right? So people can alter Wikipedia, so that's why it's not good, but they can give references and add to those references, and you can find those citations and follow it if it's something that seems to be usable or useful to you. Outside of that, what I see a lot of people do is they may use something like WebMD. They may use something like, God forbid, I've seen this a lot, dictionary.com, right, where they just give definitions. Those aren't really credible sources of information to use. And remember, when we're talking about literature review, we're really talking about science, right? You need a science-based something that talks about the studies. So the number one, gold standard is peer-reviewed journal articles. This is articles like Nature, where researchers do their studies, write up their studies in an article, and then submit it for publication with that journal. The key part, peer reviewed. That means not only is there a filtering process where then there is a committee with that journal that's going to review what those researchers wrote, how they wrote it, verifying in some sense what they did, but then also people reading it have the opportunity to challenge it, right? That's great because by having those checks and balances, it really means like the cream rises to the top, right? It means what's left is the stuff that is published for the most part is kind of really, really good. It's the gold standard. Doesn't mean that there haven't been some articles published that shouldn't have been published. That's a whole separate topic on itself. But it is sort of the best way in which you can get that information. So that's always the gold standard. You will never get in trouble from using peer-reviewed journal articles. Edited academic books. This can be things like textbooks, good sources of information. Again, sometimes textbooks can be wrong, but the likelihood of it is much less. It can also be things like academic publications, articles in professional journals. So things like, was it Monitor? I think is the American Psychological Association, their main like newsletter journal that they send out. The NASW, National Association of Social Work, they have their own publication, and usually different divisions within those bodies will have their own too. So what's usually published in those are more like, I don't want to say opinion articles, but sometimes they are things like literature reviews, case studies, stuff like that. They may not be the highest standard of science, but they are still science. They still go through a review process, so those are oftentimes very credible. Statistical data from government websites, so things like the Centers for Disease Control, SAMHSA, SAMHSA. It's the something of American Mental Health. I forget. But if you look it up, samhsa.org, really good website. That stuff, very good, right? You can use that. Statistical data. Now, sometimes you'll see where certain government bodies may come out with more opinion-driven pieces. Those are not, right? And I don't want to go down a whole rabbit hole of politics, but whether you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, there are plenty of examples from both parties of government bodies putting out information that is more influenced by politics rather than science. That is not credible sources. And then the last one on here is kind of the caveat, right? This is the one of like, you can use it, but be careful. Website material from professional associations. Use those carefully because even the most credible of organizations, American Psychiatric Association, National Association of Social Workers, American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, all of these do still have kind of an advocacy role to it. And sometimes some of the stuff that they come up with is more advocacy based or politically based rather than science based. So remember, in the end, acceptable source of information, science-driven information is the key. All right. So the textbook makes reference to the 5 C's of a literature review, and I actually kind of like this. I thought it was a nice way of presenting that. So the first part, the first C, is cite. Cite the material you refer to and use it to help define the research problem that you will study. Appropriate use of citations. We're not quoting, right? You shouldn't really quote an APA. I'll talk about that again here in a little bit. But proper use of citations. The use of citations helps distinguish between what you read and what you learned through other sources versus your analysis and your subjective thoughts. Compare and contrast. So that is key because in a literature review, remember the point here is to kind of get an idea of all the available information, not just the stuff you want or like, or the stuff that proves your point, right? So you need to compare and contrast. Why are some of these research articles talking about the benefits of a certain therapy, but others are not? Others are saying that it may not actually be that beneficial at all, right? You kind of have to compare and contrast that, do that analysis part for it. Critique. Critically analyze, look at the articles that you are reading. Think critically. Just because somebody published an article does not mean that that is the be all end all. Yes, there's a process that it goes to, even with peer reviewed journal articles, but part of that is people reading it being critical consumers of that information. That's you now. You are a critical consumer of that information. Think when you look through that article, is there something that maybe I would have done different? Is there something that this researcher should have looked at? Now, if this was an article that was done right, they will openly share what they should have done differently in it. That's usually a basic part of any kind of research article. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing, right? You also can sit there and say, yeah, I see what they're saying, but I think they also missed this. I would have done that differently. And then finally, connect, right? Bring this all together into a cohesive package, right? All these different research articles that you looked at, all the different previous studies, the gaps, the pros, the cons, the compare, the contrast, all of it together, put it together into a cohesive package that clearly, concisely articulates what your findings are. Now, I've already hinted at this a little bit, but it's worth noting sometimes students get kind of confused and they'll use these terms interchangeably. So they'll say, like, when you say a literature review, does that mean like we're really just writing an essay or like a paper? Sometimes I've had students say annotated bibliographies. I don't know where they get that because I don't think I know when I was undergrad, I never had to write an annotated bibliography. And I would say even as a grad student, I've only had to do it a handful of times. But it's worth noting what the distinction is here, right? And they are distinct as far as what you are writing. So with a literature review, the focus is on everything that has been written about a particular topic, theory, or body of research. It is focused on the research and is much more objective in its outlook. It is often used to assess if there are gaps in research and or to give focus for a future study, right? Going back to my earlier example, DBT, teens with addiction. Has this been done before? Has anybody looked into this? Right? If yes, then hopefully there's enough available there that maybe I don't need to do a research study. If no, then that should kind of drive me on what I should do in the future if I want to look into if this is going to be an effective way of dealing with teens with addiction. Right? That's the key of a literature review. You're looking at the good, the bad, the pros, the cons. You're looking at everything and you're analyzing that data. An essay, or sometimes this is kind of what people fall more of like what you do in college for like a research paper, if you ever somebody to say research paper. These are usually having much more of a focus on proving a point. So typically it's expected that the writer only selects the sources that prove their point, and often that information obtained can be selectively used. So instead of looking at everything, the good, the bad, the pros, the cons, I'm just trying to prove a point. So I'm going to do my essay on DBT is effective in helping teens with addiction. And in that, I may include some articles that talk about how DBT can be used with addiction, how teens like DBT. And I'm going to ignore any of the other research articles that may say I shouldn't do it. There's better therapies available, better interventions. So I think you kind of see the point. That's what I mean by it's a little bit more subjective. Like it's still based in facts, but it's selective facts that you're picking, and you're selectively not using certain other facts. Now, that's not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. The reason why it's used in college is, they want you to think for yourself, come up with a solution, and then basically try to support that solution, right? So that's not a bad thing as far as academics. Literature reviews, though, are different because we're not just looking at, oh, gee, that's great. This researcher can think critically and they can come up with a solution, right? We're trying to find not if they can come up with a solution, but what the truth is. The last one on here is an annotated bibliography. As I mentioned, I've never did one of these as an undergrad. I don't know of any teacher that assigns an annotated bibliography. I'm sure there are some, maybe English teachers do it. With an annotated bibliography, essentially what you're doing is if you think of a reference section, like an APA formatting, you have to do the reference section at the end. That's what an annotated bibliography is you're going to do those references, but then importantly, after the reference, you're going to write a little synopsis of what that article is about, what that whatever source of information is that you found is about. So these can be quite lengthy, especially if you have a lot of different articles. I've seen this as a necessary step for things like a dissertation. If you're doing a dissertation in if you're going for a doctorate, oftentimes they'll have this be part of it. Sometimes some professors will do it as like a stepping stone. Like I've had students do this as a stepping stone of doing a paper, right? Because then they have to think critically about each reference and how they're going to use it. But for an annotated bibliography, can't talk today, you're not writing what you would normally think of as being a paper. It's a series of references with a description of those references. All right, next up here, the importance of APA. And I mentioned I'd talk about this earlier in the lecture. So why APA? Believe me, folks, I get it. I've been a teacher for a while. I was once a student, and as much as I may not want to admit it now, there was plenty of times when I was a student that I was cursing APA and I was thinking, why do I have to use this? This is horrible. Now, that being said, is APA, I don't even want to say difficult, but is it kind of involved? Yes. Are there a lot of rules? Absolutely. Are every single one of those rules absolutely critical? Not really, but you need to know it. You need to be able to follow it. And I feel like this is actually one of those kind of critical components is that recently, I think because of social media, the internet, etc., we're really good at coloring outside the lines. Sometimes, folks, we need to color inside the lines. Sometimes we need to follow directions, and we need to be sure that we're really clearly reading those instructions that we're following. So I think APA is a good test of that. And there is sort of a method to the madness, right? So the purpose at its core of what APA does is it helps for somebody reading what you're writing to easily verify it. That's, I mean, kind of the crux of what it is, right? So if I'm reading your literature review and I want to know, you mentioned this study, I want to know more about that study, I can easily go to that study because it's properly cited and referenced. That at its core is what it is. In addition to that, it's to clearly make a distinction in the writing between what is your opinion, what is your assumptions, what is your beliefs, versus what is somebody else's. Now, I could go on and on about APA for a long time. Right? I've been a professor long enough that I have some hot button issues when it comes to APA. Earlier in the semester, I sent out an announcement about APA and had a list of resources. If you have not looked at that announcement, look at that announcement. I assure you, it'll benefit you to review it. Right? Wink, wink. Now, I said I've been a professor for a while. I have some pet peeves when it comes to APA. First one, always include a title page. It doesn't matter what professor you have. If you're doing any kind of college level paper using APA, they're going to want a title page. As far as an abstract goes, I can tell you I never ask students for an abstract. I don't know any teacher who does. I'm not saying there aren't. If you even look at the APA manual, it says basically ask your professor. So it's worth asking if it's not clearly stated. Usually it'll be clearly stated. Don't rely on AI or Word to format it correctly. So one of the big things I've seen, and I know it right off the bat, is a lot of students will use Microsoft Word, and there's a template in there for APA formatting. It is an old version of APA. it is not properly formatted for the current version of APA. So if you use it, it's wrong. And it'll probably be marked as being wrong. At least if I'm looking at it, I will mark it as being wrong. So don't use it. AI, likewise, is not very good in my opinion. I've done it from both ends. I've done it trying to format stuff by putting certain prompts in, and I've done it where I've used it as a screening tool where I could submit papers and say, was this properly done in APA format? I can tell you it's not really good at doing that. For whatever reason, I don't really know why. I've tried different prompts. AI just won't do it. So don't rely on them to do it for you. I hate to say it, folks. I know you're not going to want to hear it. You have to know these rules. You have to learn how to do it. The good news, though, is once you format a paper correctly in APA, right, all you have to do is change around the title, change around the date, change around the course information. It's going to be the exact same. Probably one of my biggest pet peeves, though, I have to say, folks, is this one right here, right? Students oftentimes think that what APA is they can write whatever they want, right? Whole paper of them just writing, no in-text citation. And then at the bottom, they'll just put a bunch of references. And it's kind of up to me, isn't this fun, to decide what part of that paper came from which reference or what part of it was their own word. Like, no, folks, no, don't do that. Right. I, from reading the paper, need to immediately see what information you got from where. So you need to use in-text citations. Also, keep in mind, and this is actually part of APA rules. If you read the APA manual, it's actually in there. Do not use direct quotes. There is an exception to this, but it's more of like a literary one. So if you were quoting something like historically famous or that's really pertinent based on the content of what's being said, then you can use a direct quote. I think your textbook makes reference at the beginning. I think of chapter 6 or 7. I'm not sure which. Maybe it was chapter 5. Of like, if I've seen far, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And I think that came from Isaac Newton. I'm not positive. Don't quote me on it. Pun intended. If you were writing that in a paper and it was really pertinent for you to put that on there, then you can quote that. But for the most part, you shouldn't quote things. You paraphrase. What does that mean? It means you put it in your own words, right? You still put a citation on it because just because it's in your own words doesn't mean the information is from you. That is the key. So put it in your own words. Don't use the direct quotes unless it's some really bizarre kind of specific situation. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about data collection strategies. And specifically on this, the textbook doesn't really do a great job. It's chapter 6. It really kind of talks about just different types of studies again. As I go through it, I'm going to talk about basically the key of like, if you're doing this type of study, this is really the kind of data you should be looking at and trying to collect. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you. Again, if you read the textbook, I don't really feel like it's as explicitly stated as I'll probably make it here. All right, folks. So we're going to start by talking about experiments. So experiments is a method of research designed to test a hypothesis under controlled conditions, key controlled, with the goal of eliminating threats to internal validity. We'll talk again about internal validity in a little bit. Towards the end of this lecture. But remember, internal validity is really kind of your ability to say that what you're testing, what you're studying is actually what you're studying in a nutshell, right? So a little bit of a refresher here, but also a little bit of a connection to what I was talking about of what do you need to collect as far as data. All right, so with any experiment, you're going to select your population first. I will stick with what I've been talking about all along. I feel like just for consistency's sake, that's easiest. And also it's hard for me to come up with examples off the cuff. So if I'm looking at can DBT help teens who are dealing with addiction, right? My population would be teens with addiction. So that's sadly probably hundreds of thousands of kids within the United States alone, just in the United States. I identified my population. I need a sample, right? I need a collection of these teenagers that could participate in my study, right? And that's what my sample is. These are people who I could actually do a study on. The sample must reflect the population. So if 52% of teens are male that are dealing with addiction, 52% of my sample should be males. If 20% of teens who are dealing with addiction are black, 20% of my sample should be black. Now, the sample is usually your participants, but I did a little bit of a break here because I want to make sure it's clear that the sample are your participants who have signed informed consent. Right. And that is key because you may have a sample, you may have a bunch of people who are willing to participate, but then you give them those informed consent forms and they don't sign them, they don't want to sign them, they don't want to continue. That is actually very common for a variety of different reasons. So, out of the sample, those who sign informed consent become your participants. Again, this should reflect that population. Now, I have my group of participants. Now I need to randomly assign them. And an experiment is key in that you have to have that random assignment. Every participant in your study has to have an equal chance of being in either the control group or the experimental group. And for the sake of this kind of flow chart, there's only one experimental group, but you can have many, many more. And I think I mentioned that previously in different lectures, right? Say if instead of seeing if DBT can help with teens with addiction, I want to look at if a certain medication is helpful. I may have 5, 10 different experimental groups, right? Because it may be based on the dose that I'm giving them. So in this case, though, I'm making it easy. I have one control group, I have one experimental group. Now, remember the difference between, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Remember, just like my participants and my sample have to reflect my population, each of these groups has to reflect that population too. So if, what I say, 52% of teens dealing with addiction are male, 52% of my control group is male, 52% of my experimental group is male. If 20% of my population of teens dealing with addiction are black, 20% of my control group are black, 20% of my experimental group are black. You can't have a difference there. And remember, the key is experiments are controlled conditions. So ideally, what we're doing here is the only difference is this independent variable, right? Everything else is the same or as similar as they can be. And with the independent variable, remember, independent variable is the thing that you're trying to see if it works, basically. It's the thing that you're doing different. The dependent variable is how you're going to measure that. So if my independent variable here is the use of DBT to treat teens that are dealing with addiction, my dependent variable may be number of teens who stop using, right, who are no longer addicted. Both the control group and the experimental group get the exact same dependent variable. So in this case, it may just be a 6-month follow-up of asking the teens, are you still using whatever, opioids, alcohol, tobacco, whatever. The independent variable in this case would be DBT, and you'd probably define it of like, a 10-week intensive DBT therapy program or something like that. The control group will not get that, the experimental group will. Now, one thing that's worth noting is oftentimes experiments incorporate what's called a pre-test, post-test. So this doesn't really work with what I've been using for DBT with addiction, but say if I was using DBT to see if it would lower PHQ-9 scores, right? So PHQ-9 is assessment that's frequently used for measuring depression. Right. So in this case, what I may do is I'll have an independent variable be the use of DBT on individuals with major depressive disorder. Right. And maybe before I even start using this independent variable in that case, I want to do a pretest. I want to see what the baseline is. So I give everybody who are participants in the study this PHQ-9 and I see what their scores are. I then give the experimental group the DBT treatment for however long I'm going to do it. Control group, I don't do anything. the end of the study, I do the dependent variable, which in this case would be the PHQ-9 again, and I compare, right? So pre-test, post-test is a comparison, right? In this case, my hope would be if DBT works in lowering the PHQ-9 scores, basically improving depression, then the pre-test score would be higher than the post-test score. In this case, post-test means like after the intervention. So hopefully that helps clarify it a little bit for you. Now, all this being said, it's worth noting it's really hard to do a full experiment in any kind of social science. Not that to say that they're never done, but it is very difficult to do them. Which brings us to the other types of studies we're going to talk about here in a second. Now, remember, I said data collection, what we need to collect in this case. If you're doing pre-test, post-test, you're basically comparing those two, the pre-test scores with the post-test scores. Otherwise, what you're really doing is you're collecting the data on a dependent variable and you're comparing and contrasting the control group with the experimental group or experimental groups if you have more than one. So at its core, that's the main data you're collecting. Now, if you have significant differences, like maybe DBT helps with black adolescents dealing with addiction, but not white, or with women, but not men, then that is also additional information that you'd probably collect out of this study. So as I mentioned, oftentimes in social sciences, it's really difficult to actually do studies that are 100% experimental in nature. Experiments are the gold standard, right? That shows cause and effect, but it's just very difficult sometimes to do that. And I'll give you some examples as I go through these. So that brings us up to the non-experimental research, of which there's several different types. At its core, though, non-experimental research is research that lacks manipulation of an independent variable and or random assignment of participants. And in many cases, those are the two things that can be kind of difficult sometimes in social sciences to actually do. So that's why it's kind of important to know about these non-experimental research methodologies. Oftentimes, I can tell you in research, non-experimental research is viewed sort of as being lesser. It doesn't have maybe as much validity, especially internal validity, which I'll get to at the end of at the lecture today. But that doesn't mean it's not important. And oftentimes, non-experimental research will lead to experimental research if it's possible. In other cases, like certain fields like social sciences, you don't have the luxury of really doing full experimental studies. So you have to rely on these non-experimental types of research. One example of that is to give you like as a for example, right? And I'll talk about this probably again as another example for one of the methodologies is, you ever think about how we know that, say, smoking causes cancer, right? Or how smoking for mothers can stunt natal development, like the development of a baby in the womb. Right? We didn't do that through experiments, folks, because that would have meant we took like mothers who are pregnant and put them in a control group, and then others and put them in an experimental group and forced those women to smoke while they were pregnant. That didn't happen, right? That would be hugely unethical. Not to say all experiments were ethical, but it just didn't happen, folks, right? So that's where these other types of non-experimental research had to come into play. So it's important to know, like, when do we use non-experimental research? Where does that come into play? I definitely gave a big example here a second ago, but what else? So a couple things to keep in mind, right? Non-experimental research is oftentimes used when the research question or the hypothesis just contains a single variable rather than a statistical relationship between variables. Oftentimes, they're used when the research question involves a non-causal statistical relationship. So not does one thing cause another, but is one thing more effective? So maybe I'm looking to go back to my example, DBT helping teens with addiction. I'm not saying, will it cure it? I'm saying, is it better? Like, is it a good option? Right? So in that case, I'm not necessarily saying causal. It's really more like, is it effective? And like, how effective is it? Third part, the research question involves a causal relationship, but The independent variable cannot be manipulated, or participants cannot be randomly assigned to conditions or orders of conditions. So say, for example, if I want to see how people respond or recover from a natural disaster or some kind of man-made disaster like a school shooting, right? I can't do an experiment that makes a tornado come down, right? I can't do an experiment that has a hurricane hit your town, or pick a school and say, sorry, folks, there's going to have to be a school shooting here because that's part of our research study, right? So I can't manipulate that independent variable in those cases. And then the last one on here is oftentimes they're used when the research question is broad or exploratory. That kind of goes back to not being causal, or explores a particular type of experience. So you can see already why non-experimental research really lends itself to social sciences. All right, so the first type of cross-sectional study that we're going to look at is cross-sectional. First type of non-experimental study we're going to look at is cross-sectional research. So this is a research method that analyzes data from a population at a single specific point in time. We oftentimes refer to it as being like a snapshot. That is different. At the bottom here, you see longitudinal studies, because longitudinal studies will follow a group of people, but over a period of time, collecting data throughout that time. So I'll give you an example, right? If I wanted to, say, do a survey of college students at Herzing University to find out what their overall stress is, right? And I do that just at the end of the semester. That'll give me a good idea of just kind of the overall prevalence, right, in that moment at the end of the semester of college students at Herzing. Doing that as a longitudinal study may be something like, I'm going to collect data on the stress levels of students at Herzing University every week from the start of the semester to the end of the semester, because I want to see what it looks like. Now, the thing is, longitudinal studies, even though they kind of do the same thing, have a lot of pitfalls, because the longer they go on, the greater the likelihood that you'll have people drop out, or, I mean, life being what it is, die. Some longitudinal studies go on for years, decades, lose interest, lose contact for some other reason. There's a whole host of different reasons on there. So oftentimes cross-sectional studies are just kind of easier, even though they don't really collect as much information. Because, for example, what I just gave you with tracking stress, it'd probably be good to know not just what stress level is at the end of the semester, but like, does it go up and down? Something tells me it probably starts pretty low and then goes up towards the end of the semester. Cross-sectional research is used to measure the prevalence of outcomes, like how prevalent is stress at the end of the semester, behaviors or diseases, and to identify correlations between variables rather than determining cause and effect. Remember, non-experimental studies do not show cause and effect. Some key things with cross-sectional research: there's no random assignment, right? Because there really is no group to randomly assign. You're just going off of people who want to, do your survey or whatever it may be. The independent variable is not manipulated. So, for example, something like Herzing University, right? I'm not changing necessarily the time, right, or what's going on during those semesters to cause the stress. I'm just trying to see, like, is there stress? Does it change during the semester? Now, there is a potential for selection bias, and what I mean by that is not necessarily an intentional thing, but sometimes, we go off of people who are, we call it low-hanging fruit, right? The easier people to study. And sometimes because of that, it can skew our results a little bit. I think the textbook makes reference to this, I may be mistaken, of where, say if you're looking at research, I'll give you a new example, right? Something like, does vegetarian lifestyle lead to lower rates of heart attack? I may do a cross-sectional study of people who've had a heart attack this year, like just now, maybe in a hospital, and ask them if they're vegetarian or not. The problem with that is I'm probably only talking to people who've had a heart attack, not people who didn't. I'm kind of relying off of the information that they're saying that they're willing to talk to me. So maybe in some weird way, like people who were vegetarian and had a heart attack, you know, are just more willing to talk for whatever reason than people who had a heart attack who are vegetarian, right? I don't know because I can't collect that data. So that's one of the things that can be kind of problematic about this. Next up, we have correlational research. So with correlational research, this is a non-experimental research in which the researcher is interested in the relationship between two variables, at least two variables. It can be more. The researcher makes no attempt to influence the variables, and the relationship between variables can usually be visualized with the aid of something like a graph, such as a scatter plot. There are numerous statistical measures that are used to analyze the strength of that relationship then. And we're not going to go into all that because that's statistics. It's worth noting pure correlational research oftentimes is done more of like an archival pattern, right? So I can do research looking at something like I mentioned statistical data from government agencies. And I can draw a correlation there between, you know, whatever it may be, increased suicide and, you know, use of tobacco products or something like that, right? If one's going up, so is the other, they're correlated. How strongly correlated are they? Well, that's where I would use the whatever type of analysis, statistical analysis that'd be relevant. And there's a bunch, right? There's like dozens of different types of statistical measures that you can use to analyze that. That's the key part though. With correlational research, you're really looking at identifying the variables and then measuring how much they're correlated. Keep in mind though, correlation is not causation. And what really differentiates a correlational research from, say, the cross-sectional we talked about before, it's like I said, purely correlational research. You don't even really need to interact with people. I don't need to send out a survey or a questionnaire. I can, but a lot of times it can just be looking at statistical data that's already been collected. All right. Next up is observational research, which, depending on the source you find, sometimes you'll see where that term observational research is applied to any non experimental research. I don't necessarily agree with that terminology, but I'm just saying you will find that. So, with observational research, really the way I look at that is what you're talking about is really what we call naturalistic observations, right? So, with this, it's a type of research that seeks to explore an aspect of the world without alteration. You are essentially seeing things in as close to the natural setting as is possible. I think I mentioned this before, where really what you're doing is kind of almost like a National Geographic like documentary, you know, where they're showing like the gazelles on the plains of Africa, and you're just observing it and seeing how they interact, how they raise their young, you know, how they hunt, how they play. That's kind of what you're doing here. Um, Pure naturalistic observation, observational research, is rarely done as a standalone thing, right? Sometimes what you'll see is that it can be done early on in a research process where they're doing observational research that will then lend itself towards maybe a quasi-experimental type of research, which we'll talk about next, or a correlational research, or, you know, who knows what, maybe even a full-on experiment. There is something though called the Hawthorne effect. So what the Hawthorne effect says is that basically humans, when we know we're being watched, oftentimes kind of put our best foot forward, right? You know, a good example of this is if you ask somebody like, "Do you wear your seatbelt when you're in your car?" Right? People are much more likely to say, "Yeah, they do," than no, even if they don't actually buckle their seatbelt. Why? Well, it's not necessarily that they're intentionally lying. Like sometimes it's just sort of like how they present themselves or how they think. You know, this happens quite a bit with people with diet, you know, where they're still gaining weight and you ask them about their exercise or their diet and they're like, I don't get it. Like I eat vegetables every day. Well, to them, it probably stands out, you know, the 1 day a week or 2 days a week that they eat vegetables because they don't like them and it just really stands out to them. Right. That's an example of it. Um, I think the example I used before with the Hawthorne effect and naturalistic observation is, if I want to see how kids interact with one another on a playground, I'm probably not going to want to be the adult standing in the corner where they can see them, taking down notes on a notebook and recording it, because they're probably going to be on their best behavior. Now, when we talk about observational types of research, it's worth noting that there's kind of two main types here. And you see it worded here as overt observation and covert observation. So overt is where the participants know they're being watched, right? So if I want to see how kids interact with one another in a playground, I'm going to say, hey kids, I'm a psychologist. I'm doing research on how you all interact with one another on the playground. Don't mind me. I'm just going to stand in the corner taking notes, right? That's overt. They know why I'm there. Covert is where the participant doesn't know that they're being watched. So an example of that sounds super creepy is, instead of me saying, hey kids, I'm going to be here to watch your, behavior. Maybe I'm watching behind like a double mirror, or maybe I have recording equipment set up and I'm hiding in the bushes, or I'm watching it from a remote location or something like that, right? They don't know. There is also a combined approach that kind of does both of them. And the way that looks is where obviously the participants know you're there, but they don't know the reason why you're there, right? So an example of that is a study that I talked about, I believe last week or the week before, which is called the Humphrey study. So this is where the gentleman was studying the sexual behaviors in a public restroom of gay men. And those gay men knew he was there. He was basically saying like, hey, I'll be on watch at the front door, right? So people don't walk in or the cops don't come. That's why these men thought that he was there. Why he was really there, though, was he was taking down their license plates. He was documenting what they were doing, who they were, so that he could do follow-up information later, right? So that's why it's kind of a combined thing. They knew he was there, so it's covert in that aspect, but they didn't know why that he was there, that he was being watched. So that was that was the covert part. The overt was that they obviously knew he was there. Sorry, probably a little confusing. All right, now we're going to go into quasi-experimental research. And to kind of back up a little bit with observational research, what kind of data you're collecting is honestly just descriptive in nature. You may use terms like most students, most kids did this, most participants, blah, 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 blah. Maybe even basics of numbers like 3 out of 5 kids, use the slide when they're at their playground or something like that. But there really isn't a ton of statistical data, correlational data, anything like that. It really is more descriptive in nature. All right, so moving on to quasi-experimental. And this is probably one of the most important types of research that's done in social sciences. These are also sometimes referred to as field experiments. So this is a type of research strategy that estimates the causal impact of an intervention without using random assignment. It mimics experimental research by including a control group and a treatment group, but participants are not randomly assigned. It's ideal for real-world scenarios where randomization is impractical or unethical. Researchers usually identify a comparison group that is similar to the treatment group. So I'll give you some examples here. And I kind of already did give you a few. Say if I want to look at something like how people recover in a community that was devastated by a natural disaster, like a hurricane, right? I can't make an experiment like that, right? I can't make an experiment where I create a hurricane and have it hit one city, but have an identical city that isn't hit by a hurricane, and then see how they diverge in their development or how they recover mentally, physically, and economically, whatever. So that's one example, right? Something like school shootings and how people respond to school shootings, right? Again, I can't do that as a full experiment, a classical experiment. It'd be hugely unethical. A little bit less severe, but more realistic of an example of that is a study that I did where it involved using motivational interview techniques on children in a public school that were dealing with chronic absenteeism. If I did that as a full experiment, it would be kind of weird, because then basically what I'd be doing is saying I want to have a control group that has kids that aren't going to school, but we're not going to do anything with them. We're just going to let them not go to school. Right? That's not ethical. Can't really do that. So in that case, what I did was we looked at the kids who had the chronic absenteeism and we kind of did a pre-test, post-test, right? So what was their rate of absenteeism for the prior school year? And we compare that to this school year after they had this motivational interviewing technique applied to them through a formal program, right? Or maybe what we do is we look at the average for the kids that went through this program and compare that to the average absenteeism at that school overall. So to see if maybe it was effective or not. Some key things with quasi-experimental research, there is no randomization because you really can't do randomization. There is an independent variable, which is what really differentiates this from really more of the purely observational types of studies. And the quasi-experimental research has really strong external validity. Remember, external validity is really kind of like how you can apply it to different settings, how applicable it may be to different settings, different populations. As far as data that's collected on here, it's kind of largely the same thing that would be collected from an experiment, right? So you are still looking at kind of a compare and contrast. In this case, though, what you're doing is not comparing an experimental group to a control group because you don't really have a control group. You're doing the group that you're focusing on, kind of the treatment group, with a similar type of group that maybe didn't go through that type of experience, right? So we're not completely manipulating an independent variable with them. So I just mentioned external validity, and last week I talked about internal and external validity. It's worth noting when we talk about internal validity, this is something that you would collect as far as data, or at least discuss when you're publishing the results of any kind of study, is kind of talk about the aspects of external and internal validity. Remember that internal validity is the extent to which the study supports the conclusion that changes to the independent variable were responsible for the observed change. Basically, the internal validity is how well does the research study that you did actually tie in to what you're saying you wanted it to do. So using the example I've given several times, DBT and teens dealing with addiction, really high internally valid type of research study would show, yeah, absolutely. Like we're really looking at just DBT and addiction, right? And we're looking at those connections between the two. Now, keep in mind, based on the type of research study that's done, sometimes you have inherently higher internal validity than we do with others. And really the key to measuring this is limiting those confounding variables, right? So with a pure experiment, we have the highest level of internal validity because they're very structured and they're very controlled. So we can limit kind of the outside world interfering with our results. So we can say that it has a high level of internal validity. And indeed, experiments, when done right, have the highest level of internal validity. It's just inherently they do. Correlational research has the lowest, right? If I'm just looking at data of, you name it, whatever it may be. What were some of the examples that I gave? Whatever off the top of my head, smoking and heart disease or something like that, right? I can connect those and say they're correlated, and they're probably strongly correlated, but I can't say that they're the only thing, right? That's why we say correlation is not causation, because there's probably a whole host of other factors that come into play there, and there is. So correlational research generally has the lowest internal validity. Now, that's still saying there's some there. Other things like naturalistic observational research doesn't have any real internal validity, right? Because that's just not what you're doing with it. Now, the quasi-experimental research kind of is somewhere in the middle, right? It's about at the halfway point. So it has higher internal validity than correlational research, but not as much as the experimental research. And again, remember, quasi-experimental is actually the most common type of research done in social sciences, simply because we don't really have the luxury in a lot of cases of doing fully experimental research. All right, folks. So that's the end of this presentation. As always, if you do have any questions, comments, concerns, you're just really not understanding anything that I went through, that's fine. Reach out to me. Please, please, please reach out to me. Send me an email, send me a Canvas inbox message. I have office hours. They're on the homepage for the class, and the link for the virtual office hours are there. Remember, office hours is your time to just come in without an appointment, pop in, and ask me whatever you want. Now, because it's open to everybody, sometimes there may be a little bit of a wait, but I promise you, if you show up, I'll talk to you. I'll get you where you need to go. If you can't make office hours, just send me a message to the Canvas inbox, letting me know of at least 3 good days, times that we can meet, and I'll make every attempt to try to meet with you. Oh, right. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to go over the activities that are going to be due this week. So let me go ahead and share my screen in Canvas and we'll go over those assignments. All right, so I'm sharing my screen now, and just like with the past weeks, we have 2 different activities that we're going to be doing this week. The first one is the Unit 3 discussion. And for this, it's going to play off of the 5 C's that I talked about earlier in the lecture. So let's scroll down to what you need to do here. So in addition to what I talked about in the lecture, there's an article embedded in the modules that talks about the 5 C's. Review that article, and then in this, you're going to specifically address kind of the 5 C's. So discuss the 5 C's of writing a literature review kind of in your own words. Thinking about that, which of the 5 seems to be the most important as you think about your study? And this is another example of where the discussion and actually the assignment for this week are both going to tie into that larger assignment that is going to be due towards the end of the semester. So think about the 5 C's. Think about which of those is going to be the most important for your study, for the assignment you're going to do at the end of the semester. What are some strategies you can recommend for writing a thorough literature review? So this is in addition to which of the 5 C's. Your initial post must be at least 300 words, including references. Now, as always, in addition to the initial post, you do have to respond to 2 other peers. Some students have asked me, do I want it on different days? Technically it should be on different days. That isn't something I'm going to really hold against anybody, because I kind of feel like sometimes what happens is by delaying it on different days, it leads to life happening and people just forgetting. So I'm not really strict on that. But make sure we are sticking to good substantive feedback for your fellow students. All right, so that's the discussion. Initial post should be done Wednesday prior to midnight. Those responses should be done Sunday prior to midnight. Now, the other assignment we're going to be doing, the other activity, is the Unit 3 assignment, which is an actual literature review. Now, this also ties into that major assignment that's going to be due at the end of the semester. And what I want you to do is to do a draft literature review for your final assignment. It should be a 4-page literature review. Remember what I talked about in the lecture: an intro, the body paragraphs, how you're going to present it, if it's going to be thematically or if it's going to be chronologically or methodologically, and then the conclusion. You should have between 5 and 7 peer-reviewed sources and should align with your topic and research question, right, which we've already done. Now, this is where I do have to do a little bit of a disclaimer here, in that the paper needs to be done in APA format. You do need to have a title page, no abstract, right? So that doesn't count as part of those 4 pages. The disclaimer part, though, is that I just mentioned in the lecture that literature reviews are comprehensive, right? It's all the available research. Chances are for most of you, your topics are broad enough that you would probably find 20 or 30 different articles if you looked at all the available research. So you don't have to do that. You don't have to look at all available. I would suggest, though, you look at more than 5 or 7, so aim for 10 to 12 that you're reviewing, and then 5 to 7 that you're going to include. And I challenge all of you to not just look at the sources that kind of support what you're saying, but also look at opposing views. So at least one that looks at an opposing view. As always, look at the rubric prior to submission. I can tell you most students that start getting points taken off do it just for stupid, obvious mistakes that they shouldn't have made. As always, folks, if you do have any questions, comments, concerns about this or about the content, please reach out to me. I'm always available. The assignment, Unit 3 assignment, will be due Sunday prior to midnight. Of course, I'm kind of flexible on those due dates. I'll let you know when/if I start becoming less flexible with it. Usually that tends to happen as we get closer towards the end of the semester, because what happens is students just keep kicking the can, and then I look and I have half the class that didn't do hardly any assignments, and then I have to kind of rein it in a little bit. But otherwise, folks, I say most of you are doing a really good job. Most of you are keeping up with it, so continue to do so, and you're going to have no problems at all. Take care, everybody.